From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. 4 days to Election Day, and the debate devolves into remarks from Donald Trump that many perceived as a threat to Liz Cheney. We'll have reaction from Vice President Kamala Harris, and we'll discuss the closing stages of this campaign with Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida. We'll also talk with Republican Congressman Greg Murphy of North Carolina, where early voting has defied expectations following Hurricane Helene, even as the storm had a major impact on today's jobs report. And that is where we begin. 4 days until the election, the number one issue for voters, of course, since this campaign began, has been the economy. That remains the case. The October jobs report this morning rising at the slowest pace since 2020, with the addition of only 12,000 jobs. Acting Labor Secretary Julie Su reacted to the effects of last month's dual hurricanes on the report, along with strikes, when she spoke with Bloomberg TV this morning.
We don't have granular data about that, but I think it's a rational conclusion that the impacts of the hurricanes were devastating. I mean, they were devastating to human life. They were devastating to those communities in the Southeast, but they also are showing up in the jobs report. Having said that, the overall labor force participation rate also remains, it's steady.
Joining our conversation now, Bloomberg's Enda Curran with us from Washington. Enda, it's great to see you. Thanks for being here. On the Friday edition of Balance of Power, we noted the collection rate for the survey here, and looking to the response rate to the establishment survey at only 47%, well below last month's level, and in fact the lowest response rate to the survey, Enda, since 1991. I'm assuming we're in for a massive revision here when it comes to the monthly data. What should we expect?
Yeah, it's a complicated set of data today, Joe. As you mentioned there, on a headline basis, it looked like the October employment market was quite weak. But within that, complications in gathering the data due to those horrific hurricanes, complications in terms of just getting the survey out to businesses and people. And on the other side of the hurricanes, of course, we had a big strike at Boeing, which also impacted the headline employment number. And that's where we came up with this weak addition of 12,000 jobs created in a month. So you do have technical complications there. The positives from that report were that the unemployment rate itself held steady at 4.1%. Wages also, by the way, increased. Earnings per hour increase, another sign of a fairly boisterous, robust jobs market. So, yes, on the one hand, of course, there's a headline that this is a weak and negative jobs number. But like you mentioned, it's very complicated due to the impact of the hurricane and the Boeing strike. Well,
of course, there's no hurricane now, and it looks like Boeing may be making progress here and have a breakthrough with the striking workers as soon as next week. So presumably, the next month's data will show a spring back. But this is all we're going to get. And between now and the election and now and next week's Fed meeting, does this ensure or complicate a 25 basis point cut?
It's certainly closing the book on the economy for the Biden-Harris administration. Joe noted about it. In terms of the Fed next week, again, you'd have to say at a headline basis, it probably lends itself towards the central bank having to ease or bring down interest rates, because even if you step away from the hurricane impact and you look at where the hiring is going on, it still relies a lot on the government hiring workers around the country. It's still relying a lot on healthcare hiring workers around the country. Yes, there is expected, of course, to be a big rebound when the figures come out next month. For November, but net, I think a lot of economists were saying that on balance it leans towards the Fed going by another 25 basis points next week, but not by a huge amount. But of course, the Fed very much second fiddle to what we get with the election result next week also.
Well, of course, we're always looking at data through the prism of politics on this program, Enda, and you're no stranger to this conversation. If I can put you on the spot, this has been an important data week. A lot of folks have not voted yet, even though we've had an enormous number vote early in this campaign. How would you describe the state of the economy as Americans decide on their next president?
The economy is strong, no doubt about it. We had robust data this week, strong GDP data, strong consumer sentiment, and plenty of people making the point that the Labour data today doesn't suggest the jobs market's falling off a cliff either. So the economy writ large couldn't be in a stronger position going into the election. Of course, the negatives and the nuance is that inflation has been high over the past few years. Prices remain high, and that is, of course, impacting workers and households. And that's where the sting in the successful economy story is.
Always learn something from Bloomberg's Enda Curran. Great to have you, Enda. Thank you. Have a great weekend. Vice President Harris this afternoon as we dig into this race now, reacting to comments by former President Trump about former Congresswoman Liz Cheney. You've probably heard this by now. Quote, "She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle," he said, standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her. "Let's see how she feels about it," he said, "you know, when the guns are trained on her face," unquote. The response now from Vice President Kamala Harris.
This must be disqualifying. Anyone who wants to be president of the United States who uses that kind of violent rhetoric is clearly disqualified. His enemies list has grown longer. His rhetoric has grown more extreme.
Let's bring in Bloomberg's Megan Scully, who's, of course, watching this race every day for us from her perch in Washington. Megan, are we so numb now that none of the rhetoric like this matters, or could this have a meaningful impact on the race?
It's hard to tell, although just a few days before the election and coming off of the comments over the weekend at the Madison Square Garden rally, this certainly doesn't help the former president attract the same voters that Liz Cheney is actually hoping to help Harris attract in the days before the election. It certainly continues in Trump's violent imagery, particularly imagery he uses against his political opponents. And it prompted a pretty fierce backlash from the Harris camp, as well as from Liz Cheney herself, who said, "This is what a dictator sounds like."
She did. The response from Liz Cheney, quote, "This is how dictators destroy free nations. They threaten those who speak against them with death," unquote. Is that pushing the line a little bit far here, Megan? This was something that was said in a quip during a Halloween event with Tucker Carlson. And frankly, I don't know if this is new from Donald Trump. Does this represent a new level in the rhetoric?
So I think, it depends on who you ask, right? If you ask the Trump campaign, they said, well, he was just speaking, metaphorically, and he was just trying to point to the fact that she is a war hawk, and Trump, of course, is much more of an isolationist. If you talk to the Harris campaign or to Cheney herself, it is, they would say, this is, as the vice president said, violent rhetoric. It's certainly painted a pretty gruesome picture, no matter which way Trump meant it. And so I think that it's one of those things we're trying to parse, and certainly we've been doing that all week, including with President Biden's gaffe earlier this week regarding the famous garbage gaffe. But it certainly doesn't help, I would say, this close to the election.
Yeah, he was making news as well earlier about RFK Jr., who, of course, was running against him and is still on the ballot in Wisconsin and Michigan. The former president saying that RFK Jr. set for major food and health role in his potential administration. Listen to what he said.
He is a great guy. I've known him a long time. And all he wants to do is very simply, he wants to make people healthy.
This is, of course, someone who's known as being a vaccine skeptic. Megan, how would this go over?
I think that a lot of people in Congress would be scratching their heads at this one. He's certainly signaling it far enough in advance that if Republicans do take control of the Senate and Trump does win, perhaps he can rally Republicans around RFK Jr. as a pick. But that would be a big job for somebody who is a vaccine skeptic, who has raised lots of other concerns about, food guidelines in this country, and particularly coming on the heels of a pandemic, I think would put a lot of people sort of on their back foot here.
It's good to see you, Megan. Thank you, as always, for the insights. Bloomberg's Megan Scully with us on Bloomberg. As we take now a turn to New York politics, and an important development today you should know about. New York City Mayor Eric Adams is set to stand trial in his federal corruption case on April 21st. In the midst of his re-election campaign, that date was set by the judge at a hearing Friday here today in Manhattan. While the defense argued to dismiss the bribery charge, that bribery count is one of 5 in the indictment. Adams has pleaded not guilty. Coming up, we're joined by Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida for a closer look at the battle for the House. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The United States Senate unequivocally will become Republican, 2 seats minimum, probably 4 or 5. Now the nail biter, candidly, that really affects me because as chairman of the Energy and Water Subcommittee on Appropriations, that chairmanship rests on us maintaining control in the United States House of Representatives. That will be, candidly, I think, a closer race. I feel better day by day, but it's going to be a close one.
Republican Congressman Chuck Fleischman of Tennessee talking with us earlier this week on Balance of Power, sharing his insights and predictions for the outcome of both the House and Senate. Joining us now, Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida, fresh off a polling location. Congresswoman, it's great to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm going to get into all of this horse race business with you 4 days out from the election, but I have to start by asking you about some of the rhetoric that we've been hearing on the campaign trail. Before you joined us, we were in a conversation about what Donald Trump said about Congresswoman or former Congresswoman Liz Cheney last evening. Quote, "She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her. Let's see how she feels about it when the guns are trained on her face." Some think this was him making reference to the fact that she might think differently if she were in harm's way in combat on the battlefield carrying a rifle. Others saw it as a death threat. And I'm wondering where you are on this with 4 days out, if the rhetoric is actually impacting anyone at this point or if we're just all numb to it.
Joe, thanks for having me. And I appreciate the question because the dangerous rhetoric that Donald Trump spews from the revenge tour that he has promised, if God forbid he gets anywhere near the White House again, where he's been creating an enemies list and plans retribution against people who he thinks have wronged him, to this horrific comment that I think it was very clear what he meant. It's very clear that he was suggesting that there should be consequences for Liz Cheney, who is a friend and former colleague of mine, if she continues to campaign against him. And his suggestion that her point of view when it comes to protecting our allies and fighting for democracy, and instead of the thugs and the authoritarians that he plays footsie with, it's very clear that not only is Donald Trump indicating that what he thinks should happen to Liz Cheney if she continues her support for Kamala Harris, he's endangering her life, because we know that comments like this inspire extremists. And he should know better, since he certainly had some experience with that recently.
Well, he has. And I know you're being literal, because I know you have also been threatened repeatedly over the course of your political career. I can only imagine what Liz Cheney has endured, and I know that she's had to engage security. At least there's been reporting to that extent ever since she joined the January 6th Commission. Is this just the new reality of serving an elected office?
I certainly hope not, because I know I have had to have massive detail when I have had my life threatened as well. And what it does is it interferes with our ability, particularly in the House of Representatives, for example, when you have to be surrounded by a phalanx of security and a security detail, it intimidates your constituents from approaching you and from being able to do the job that a U.S. representative was elected to do, and that's to be engaged with our people. And Donald Trump not only really is an enemy of democracy, he is willing to use the kind of rhetoric and dangerous plans that he publicly states he's making that jeopardizes others' lives and certainly is endangering our democracy. And that's what's at stake in this election. I mean, that's why we've got 4 days.
We've been talking about garbage for, I think, 5 days as a major theme somehow on the campaign trail for president, starting with a very poor joke, if I can even call it that, at Madison Square Garden last Sunday. This has gone through the ringer. I don't have to give you the background with what Joe Biden said about trying to clean up remarks. Now the stenographer is apparently changing things at the White House, or the press office is, over the wishes of the stenographer, to the point where we saw Donald Trump driving around in a garbage truck. I mean, this has gotten to be like a Saturday Night Live episode. I guess my question for you is, you're sitting in Florida with one of the biggest Latino voting blocs in the nation. What about the original remark at Madison Square Garden? What impact, if any, is that going to have on outcomes in Florida?
We're seeing huge impact on the vile, disgusting rhetoric that came from Donald Trump's rally at Madison Square Garden, for which he did not express regret or indicate that he had any remorse, or even said it was unfortunate, or that it shouldn't have happened. And as a result, polling just came out that shows that 85% of Puerto Ricans that are voting in Florida are voting for Kamala Harris. 8% plan to vote for Donald Trump. Why? Because the island of Puerto Rico is, which I have been to many times, is a beautiful, vibrant place that is an important component of the United States of America, made up of 5 million American citizens who deserve honor and respect, and a president who's going to have their back, not a president who puts a program together that allows Puerto Ricans and their homeland to be called a floating pile of garbage.
We saw quite a response from some Republicans, including Rick Scott, senator in Florida. Did he say enough early enough?
Oh, please. Rick Scott has proposed repealing Social Security and Medicare and putting it on the chopping block, possibly allowing it to go away forever and be reauthorized every 5 years. This is not a U.S. senator that understands the needs of our elderly, nor does he understand the needs of our Hispanic community. He votes against their interests, particularly their economic interests. And I mean, this is a guy who aligns himself firmly with Donald Trump. So, you know, him saying something nice about Puerto Rican voters doesn't cut the mustard.
Well, I know you're not a fan, but he did say the joke was not funny, not true, and Puerto Ricans are amazing people and amazing Americans. I've got to ask you about where we started, Congresswoman.
Rick
Chuck
Scott's
Fleischman,
voting record isn't.
You understood your point. Your colleague from Tennessee, a Republican, called the race for the House a nail-biter. There is this conventional wisdom that Democrats will outperform in the House, while it might be a tougher slog in the Senate. How would you describe it?
You know, I sit on appropriations with Chuck Fleischman and on his subcommittee as well that he chairs, and I am the ranking member of an appropriations subcommittee as well that takes care of our veterans and our military. These are critical issues. And I think the House, it will ultimately, the majority will swing to Democrats, because we have been championing the issues that are the most important. We've focused on reducing the cost of prescription drugs. We've focused on trying to make sure that we invested and succeeded in the most significant investment in infrastructure that we've had in modern times. We've been able to pass legislation that was historic investment in climate change and global warming, and impacting its negative impacts on states across the country. Voters are going to go to the polls and vote for the Democratic candidate in the races that are the closest, because they want to make sure that we move the country in a direction that House Democrats have been able to help us move, because Republicans can't get out of their own way. They deposed their own speaker. They've needed us for every critical vote, including not shutting the government down and not busting a hole through the debt ceiling. And so voters want a majority that is team normal, not team extreme. And that's what they'll vote for on Tuesday.
We'll remind our listeners and viewers that it could take some time before we know which party is in control of the House. We could be talking about that long after California goes to bed. Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida, thank you for being with us here on Balance of Power. Coming up, a look at how today's jobs numbers might impact swing state voters when they head to the polls on Tuesday. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall brings us that story next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for joining us. Today's jobs report shows hiring slowed dramatically ahead of next week's election, but of course that was largely due to the impact of hurricanes and strikes. But a week of data like this reminds us the economy is the top issue for voters in the race for the White House, and that is where we find Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall on the North Lawn with more right now. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Joe. Today's jobs report showing that U.S. hiring slowed to its slowest pace since 2020. As you mentioned, the Labor Department coming out saying that that was partly due to some recent labor strikes, as well as the 2 hurricanes that hit the Southeast last month. But they did say it will take a while to quantify those impacts. Now, you had the chance to catch up with the White House's Jared Bernstein earlier today on the early edition of Balance of Power to get the administration's take on these job numbers.
The Bureau itself, which they don't often do, the Bureau itself said that the hurricanes, very likely played a role here. The underlying strength of the American economy, the American labor force is ongoing. We have a full spate of reports from this week that show that to be the case. And if you look at the unemployment rate, which is far less affected by strikes and hurricanes, that held at 4.1%.
The economy is the top issue for voters in battleground states. Unemployment is below pre-pandemic levels in 6 out of 7 of those places, according to a Bloomberg analysis of the most recent government data available. Nevada does have the highest unemployment among the 7 battlegrounds. That number was above the national average before the pandemic started. A different economic indicator out this week shows Nevada as well as Michigan, another battleground we're closely watching, with economies shrinking in the third quarter. They're 2 of the 14 states that saw a contraction in GDP for the 3 months through September. That's from a gauge by the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, which serves as a proxy for a state's gross domestic product. Nationwide, GDP grew at 2.8% in the third quarter, slightly below estimates. Now, this is the data, but when it comes to how Americans are feeling about the economy, consumer confidence increased this month by the most since March of 2021. That's according to the Conference Board out this week, which shows apparent optimism by Americans about the broader economy as well as the labor market. But, Joe, it is important to point out that both this gauge as well as the University of Michigan's consumer sentiment gauge out last week shows that these numbers are still well below pre-pandemic levels.
This is great information, Tyler. I really appreciate it, especially when you put it against our polling in the Bloomberg News Swing State Survey it's been very sticky, repeatedly every month for a year shown the economy as the #1 issue for voters.
Right, exactly. And it has also repeatedly shown former President Donald Trump leading Vice President Kamala Harris on this issue. The most recent Bloomberg News Morning Consult polling showing him ahead when it comes to voter confidence on the economy by about 5 percentage points. But that varies when we look at the different battleground states. Pennsylvania, for example, that gap is 3%. So we'll have to see how it goes heading into the polls.
On the North Lawn of the White House, that's Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. Tyler, thank you. Coming up, we're joined by Republican Congressman Greg Murphy of North Carolina. Next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Thrilled to be back in this incredible state with thousands of proud, hardworking American patriots. But I'd like to ask you one very simple, easy to answer question. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?
We have an opportunity in this election to turn the page on a decade of Donald Trump, who has been trying to keep us divided and afraid of each other. We know that is who he is, but North Carolina, that is not who we are.
Donald Trump and Kamala Harris campaigning in North Carolina earlier this week. They are both returning to the key swing state tomorrow for dueling rallies in a final push to voters. Joining me now for a closer look is Republican Congressman Greg Murphy of North Carolina. Congressman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's good to see you. The last time we spoke was in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, which led a lot of people to believe that turnout in North Carolina would be deeply depressed because people simply couldn't get to polls. I know a number of rules were changed to help them. But I saw a headline today that I think is quite remarkable. More than half of North Carolina voters have already cast ballots. You're exceeding expectations despite what we saw in terms of the impact of the storm, especially in western North Carolina. How do you describe the enthusiasm you're seeing, and what has the state done right?
I think it is the enthusiasm, because people see two very different visions for the future of the country. One is the one that Donald Trump paints. The other one is the one that Kamala Harris paints. And I think people are highly motivated because they care about the future of the country. Look, Joe, I tell folks I've got more yesterdays than tomorrow. So I do this, and I do this job in Congress because I care about my kids' future and grandkids' future. I think people really are at stake people realize what's at stake. As far as the folks out in the West, they're tough folks, and it tends to be a conservative hotbed. Yep. And they're doing whatever they can to make sure they get through to vote, whether it's be on ATVs or four-wheelers or whatever. They're going to make sure that their vote is cast. Numbers aren't 100% as high as they had been in the past, but they are very, very motivated.
Can you give us a little bit of an update on the ground, Congressman? I fear that there are folks in Asheville and in other areas throughout western North Carolina who feel forgotten. This is a story that, as we typically see, fell off the front pages within days of these storms landing.
Yeah, so, Joe, I've been through, here in eastern North Carolina, I've been through, sadly enough, many hurricanes over the last 30 years. And it hits the news and everybody is involved and donations skyrocket, but then it gets out of the news. And actually, I warned folks about that this is not something that goes away in weeks or months. It's literally going to take years to help get those folks back to normal. Asheville as a city, they lost their power, they lost some of their sewer, their water. They are doing pretty well. You go over the ridge where cities, towns, neighborhoods were literally washed out. That's a much, much different story. Those folks, sadly enough, some may never be found because of the, when you put 30 inches of rain on a 1,500-foot slant and it goes down into a gorge, things get washed away. Yeah. But it's going to be a much, much greater lift for those people to come back to any sense of normalcy. Asheville's a lot better off, still tough, than a lot of those smaller towns.
Well, that's a nightmare you described for these smaller communities, Congressman. There were a lot of questions about funding in the aftermath of the two storms that landed pretty closely to each other. There were questions about whether lawmakers should return to Washington, in fact, to approve an emergency supplemental. That's, I guess, not coming immediately. What do you see for the lame duck session and how that should be handled?
Well, I think, FEMA had the money it needed originally. There wasn't a need for us to come back to Washington. Speaker Johnson, answered that question very, very well. Are we going to do something most likely in the lame duck? Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Same thing was done in our North Carolina legislature. They put in a lot of money because they saved a lot of money in the past for things just like this. And so I think there will be obviously a lot more, hundreds of, many, many billions of dollars rather, coming forth in the future.
I want to ask you about the role that ticket splitters might play in this campaign in North Carolina. We've all talked about Mark Robinson's scandal and the damage that did to his campaign. And there are questions about what kind of side effects that might have for the top of the ticket. Some folks suggested that Donald Trump may have lost North Carolina because of this whole thing. Others say ticket splitters will say yes to Trump and no to the Republican for governor. What do you see and what are you hearing on the ground?
I think that's true, and possibly. When it comes to the vote for the President of the United States, this is, I think, a much different vote than governor of the state of North Carolina. I think people look at the immigration issues, look at the economy and how inflation has destroyed their purchasing power. They look at the security of themselves, crime going through the roof. We saw the DOJ readjusted numbers, and then security of what's going on in the world. I think those are the things that drive the president's race. As far as the governor's race, I do think what happened because of CNN will definitely have caused the lieutenant governor a problem in the state of North Carolina. But I think the two issues, while I did actually think, as some propose, would have an effect, I think it's much more effect that people are looking at the bigger issues rather than just the gubernatorial ones.
Can I ask you, as a member of Congress in the Republican Party, your thoughts on the rhetoric that's been flying around out there? We've been talking about garbage for half the week here, actually the whole week, Congressman, since that joke was first told at Madison Square Garden, all the way through Donald Trump driving around in a garbage truck. He's talking about aiming guns at Liz Cheney. This has become the most recent flap here. And I know a lot of Republicans like you say, forget the rhetoric, look at the record. But there are real concerns about the impact some of this language could have on the race. How do you see it as an American?
Well, I don't see it as helpful. I don't see it as helpful, Joe. And elections are emotional things. I've been a surgeon for my entire life, so learning of the politics, learning how elections occur has been something I've done through observation. But elections are emotional things. When I had people walk up and I'd give them a card, you smile at somebody, it gives them a sense of contentment that they trust and they go in and vote for you. So on both sides of the aisle right now, I think the emotions are running high. I think the rhetoric has gotten way out of hand on both sides. On both sides. And it's not a good thing for American politics. The world does not like seeing this from America.
Well, I'll tell you, it does seem that Donald Trump's been driving the conversation over the past couple of days here. Congressman, do you worry about violence breaking out? We've got polling left and right that shows a majority of Americans are worried. They're anxious about what the heck's going to happen next week.
Well, I had a state legislature this morning. A fella came up and a Republican threatened him with a gun, threatened him to, not with a gun, but said he was going to shoot him, come back and shoot everybody there. Sadly enough, and I'm going to say that, people want to point to Trump and say he's the only reason for all this. That's nonsense. That's nonsense. If you listen to what Joe Biden said, you especially listen to what Obama has been saying. And then Kamala, in my opinion, hasn't been talking really about policy. It's just how much we should hate Donald Trump. So, and I know the former president he doesn't get a get out of jail free card on these things, but still it's rhetoric that is going higher and higher and higher. People care about the issues. They say, what's going to happen to my family? Is my family secure? Am I going to have a job? How can I pay for things? Those are things that people really, that's what they need to care about. We don't need to get off track on some of this other nonsense.
Let's try not to. We try to talk policy around here on Bloomberg, and I hate even having to spend the time talking about this, Congressman. I hope that people will be basing their decisions on what's best for their families. Republican Congressman Greg Murphy of North Carolina, thanks for joining us, as always, on Bloomberg. Coming up, we'll take a closer look at the comments that Donald Trump made last night that I just mentioned about Liz Cheney. Our signature panel weighs in next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. When the guns are trained on her face. They're all war hawks when they're sitting in Washington in a nice building saying, oh, gee, let's send 10,000 troops right into the mouth of the enemy.
Donald Trump speaking about former Congresswoman Liz Cheney last night while campaigning in Arizona alongside Tucker Carlson. Joining us now, our signature panel on the Friday edition, Rick Davis, Stonecourt Capital Partner, Jeanne Sheehan Zaino, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. We have made it to the weekend before the election, and it's great to have both of you with us. Jeanne, this is just the latest. I guess we can't call it an October surprise because it's the 1st of November. I'm out of questions. Does this matter or not?
I think it does. We'll know more maybe Tuesday, maybe a few days after. I think it's a reminder. Let's put it this way. He's doing more harm to himself than Kamala Harris is doing to him. And this is sort of the story of Donald Trump. He can't get out of his own way. Now, I understand later in the day he's been focusing on the jobs numbers, which makes sense. Regardless of how I think he's misstating it, it makes sense. But he should be focusing on issues that help him, the economy, immigration. But he can't get out of his own way. It's garbage. It's shooting people in the face. Even the point he was trying to make here is an important one. Should we be having such a broad footprint overseas? Should we be sending our young men and women into harm's way? But there is a way to say that, not in the way he does. His rhetoric is inexplicable, and it is going to hurt him in the end.
Well, of course, there are Republicans who say there's Joe Biden, who was happy to use the word garbage earlier this week. Rick, I know the White House cleaned up the language, or tried to, that he used, but you heard the congressman from North Carolina just now. Greg Murphy says the rhetoric is awful on both sides. Is he right?
Yeah, I think so. Pox on all their houses. Nobody has taken the high ground. We were told, we didn't expect it from Trump. I mean, we knew what his gig is since 2015. But Kamala Harris went to the Democratic convention in Chicago and said she was for joy and happiness. And from that point on, she's been talking about Donald Trump. And the reality is you have to, right? I mean, you can't not engage in negative campaigning. But there's a limit to that. And I think John McCain showed it once during the 2008 campaign when, a woman in a town hall tried to impugn the character of Barack Obama. And he said, no, that's not where we're going in this campaign. And I'd love to see a moment like that in this campaign, but I'm not holding my breath through the weekend.
Yeah, I don't think you'll make it. You'll pass out pretty quickly here, Rick. That was an important moment, of course, and we do remember that moment when he said that he was a good family man. Jeannie, I don't know your thought on the impact here that it might have on the campaign. As we just discussed with the congressman, half of the voters in North Carolina have already had their say. So who's left?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. 65 million plus Americans have already voted. I mean, this is quite different from the way it was when we grew up and there was an actual election day.
Yeah.
I think it makes sense. It gives people more options, and it seems like it's getting more people out to vote. We'll have to see, so that's a good thing. But it does mean, to your point, that these last-minute, late stories don't have as much of an impact. That said, this is all about a few thousand people in each of these swing states, the 4% as we call them, and it could have an impact. I mean, we don't know, but 2016, it was, October, 28th, 29th, when Comey came out, and that had an impact. So, we'll have to see if this does. But either way, Donald Trump is making a mistake and hurting himself, and any campaign manager would tell you that.
Well, we all know the economy is the #1 issue in this campaign, not the rhetoric. And as we just heard from Tyler Kendall at the White House, this is going to be driving more votes than anything else. And on this Jobs Day, it couldn't be more important. On the early edition of Balance of Power, I talked about that with Jared Bernstein, the chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, what he had to say here about today's jobs numbers ahead of the election.
Going at a solid pace, generating enough jobs to hold the unemployment rate where it is, so hitting what economists call the break-even level. I think the main thing from the perspective of American working households is that this jobs report, including in October, is generating real wage gains.
So, Rick Davis, you add this narrative here, and I know there was a lot of noise around the numbers because of the hurricane. You don't really get a very good snapshot of the month. Today's AAA national average unleaded gas, $3.12 a gallon. I'm tanking up for $2.80-something in Virginia right now. We saw the PCE data this week. A lot of people favor Donald Trump when it comes to the economy, but are these numbers advantage Harris?
Well, every good news item in the economy between now and the close of polls on Tuesday afternoon is good news for Kamala Harris. Whether or not they're taking good effect of it, I really question. I mean, what was Kamala Harris doing today to crow about her administration's fantastic numbers, with the economy? I mean, it really is an incredible story. The most interesting story I read all week was somebody who's going to be president next year is going to have a great economy to start with. Well, how about a great economy to end with? I really don't get it. It is the #1 issue consistently throughout this campaign. Nothing's changed in 2 years of polling on that. And the reality is that there's a story to tell for the Biden administration, but they don't tell it. And sadly, like what Jeannie was saying, Donald Trump doesn't even want to talk about economic issues these days. And yet, I got to believe there are still voters out there who think that's the most important thing.
It wasn't just the jobs report, it was the PCE data this week. Although in the statement from Joe Biden, we have more to do. Is the lack of self-congratulating, the lack of a victory lap at the White House thought to be tone deaf part of the problem?
It could be, although I think at this point, Democrats would prefer to keep Joe Biden off of the campaign trail.
Well, I get that.
Yesterday he was, biting children who were dressed as turkeys?
Was that a problem?
Listen.
I saw the picture.
It was very grandfatherly, I suppose. It's been a problem for Democrats.
Yeah.
Joe Biden is not going to sell Kamala Harris. And so Democrats probably prefer at this point he stay in Rehoboth and keep behind the scenes. But they should be talking about the economy. But I have to say, part of this, we as American citizens and voters own this. These campaigns are giving us what they think is going to move us. And unfortunately, that is not a solid policy debate like we deserve. And that is problematic.
I thought Commander was the one doing the biting at the White House.
You got to see the pictures, Joe. It's depressing.
The dog was a problem. Coming up, more than 68 million, imagine that, have already cast votes. Can Kamala Harris and Donald Trump's final campaign push make a difference with just 4 days left? We'll play that to the panel next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Historically, elections in the United States are, while quite complex, exceptionally well run. And the incidence of true voter fraud or moments where large numbers of votes that cannot be counted for some reason in numbers that could actually sway the outcome of the election, that just doesn't exist.
That's Julie Pace, executive editor at the Associated Press, talking with us on the early edition of Balance of Power. Really enjoyed that conversation, getting into how they're prepared to handle questions surrounding election integrity. Of course, they'll be calling the races at the AP next week, with more than 68 million people already having cast their vote early through in-person or mail-in balloting, according to the University of Florida's election lab. Vice President Kamala Harris, former President Donald Trump, still making their final pitches to voters, of course, throughout the weekend. They're going to be barnstorming the swing states. And back with us now, our closers, our signature panel, Rick Davis and Jeanne Sheehan Zaino. Jeanne, I wonder your thought on this and the concerns that you might have. We've heard some reporting of ballot boxes being set on fire, some ballots being destroyed and so forth, and that can slow the process, make the Associated Press's job more difficult and start to infect confidence in the system all over again. Is that the conversation we're having next week?
I think it is. And I think we've been working up to that all week this week. We've heard a number of stories about that. We are seeing all kinds of social media videos and others that are obviously fake, but that can be really impactful at the ballot box. So I do think this is going to be the story. And of course, from Donald Trump's campaign, a lot of focus on fraud in Pennsylvania, even though those folks on the ground will tell you that they have no evidence of it. So I do think this is going to be the story. And both campaigns have lawyered up on this. Kamala Harris hired Mark Elias. He's a really good attorney. Right. He's going to be running this for them. Trump has his own people. So they know that this is where we are headed. And I think, Joe, that's going to be your next 2 weeks.
Oh, my. I think you too. You're in for the ride as well. Everyone's lawyering up here. Rick, you were with us when we talked to Julie Pace earlier. She's got a heck of a job, and one that she describes in an op-ed today in the AP as the most important act of journalism. We're going to be following these calls by the Associated Press next week. There's still the gold standard in this act, but that's a more stressful and risky job than ever right now, isn't it?
Yeah, it's so easy to get canceled just by calling a state out. And I really respect the diligence that news media goes through, especially the AP. They take it very seriously. They commit enormous resources to it. And they see it as an obligation of the public to get it right. And so I have no doubt this is going to be one of the most straightforward, honest, and well-reported election days that we've ever had, because everyone wants to instill public confidence in the system. And so I think it's incumbent upon both parties to do the same thing and respect the results as they come in and understand that there's going to be some gamesmanship in the process, but that at the end of the day, we want to have a winner who's supported by the system. And I really appreciate the fact that organizations like AP, all the other networks have decision desks. They're going to be doing the same thing. You know, let's get it right this time.
Let's get it right this time. If last election was the most litigated in history, will this be the most scrutinized in advance?
I think it absolutely will, and I think we have to remember these are our friends and neighbors at these polls. Those are our poll workers in America, and so we respect them, and they do the best job they can.
In fact, we told the story earlier of early voting when I went in Northern Virginia yesterday. It was a festive atmosphere. The parking lot was jammed. The election workers were smiling. People were happy to be in line. And when new people, the first-time voters, showed up, they'd get a round of applause, because this is a great thing that we're about to do together. And if you already have, thanks for doing your duty. Rick Davis and Jeanne Sheehan Zaino, thank you for a great conversation. We've got a big week ahead. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter to get ready. And thanks for joining us on Bloomberg TV and Radio.